Alrighty, so we'll get started now. This presentation will also be recorded and posted to our YouTube, Arlington Human Rights, because there's going to be a tremendous amount of information that we're going to give you tonight. This is just the first of a series of housing discussions that we are going to be having, which we thought was such an in-depth and important topic that just one of these forums was not going to get it. And we know that housing issues in and of themselves can be very dense, and there's a lot to unpack here. But first things first, my name is Crystal Haynes. I'm from the Arlington Human Rights Commission. I'm the events working group lead, and I want to welcome you to tonight's first in a series of housing forums. Tonight we are going to be focusing on equity and issues around equity, and we really wanted to bring in some folks who are working in this space. But first, I want to also make sure we set some ground rules so that we can respect our conversation, our work, and our perspectives. We all have the responsibility to respect and build on the strength that diversity provides. We will engage in polite, constructive, productive dialogue and feedback. We will respectfully disagree with each other should we need to do that. Unless you are a designated representative of an organization, opinions are considered your own. And when sharing a question, please be short and to the point. The chat is open so that if you have questions for panelists, go ahead and post those there and I will ask them to the group here. We want to use this moment and space to take time to allow for self-reflection as well. How does this impact you? How does this impact our community here in Arlington? And take deep breaths if you need to. This can be a sensitive topic. I mean, housing is certainly a human right. We believe that, and we know that there are many issues around housing that we are all very passionate about. All right, let's introduce our panel, shall we? Jamie Langowski is a clinical fellow at Suffolk University Law School and assistant director of Suffolk's Housing Discrimination Testing Program, HDTP. The HDTP's mission is to eliminate housing discrimination through testing, enforcement, education, and academic research. Attorney Langowski has many years of experience in the area of fair housing law and helped start the HDTP program at Suffolk Law School. Attorney Langowski has co-developed and co-taught multiple experiential fair housing law courses and is a frequent speaker on topics related to fair housing and testing. We also have with us Pamela Hallett. She joined the HCA as the executive director in June 2012, bringing with her over 25 years of affordable housing and community development experience. Her past experience includes 20 years with her own development and consulting firm, which specialized in affordable housing. The firm developed more than 1,500 units of housing, securing more than $100 million in construction and permanent financing. It provided expertise in tax credits, financing, planning, construction monitoring, energy conservation, and negotiations. Thank you so much for being with us, Pam. And from City Life Vida Urbana is Alex Ponte Capa, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, and Connor Ring. And City Life Vida Urbana, for folks who are not familiar, is a grassroots community organization committed to fighting for racial, social, and economic justice and gender equality by building working class power. City Life Vida Urbana promotes individual empowerment, develop community leaders, and build collective power to affect systematic change and transform this society. So thank you all so much for being with us today. I do want to start with Jamie. And if you all were following this in the Globe, also, excuse me, Christina Coleman is here with us, and she works with our diversity and inclusion coordinator, Jillian Harvey. And we're so happy that Christina is here helping us facilitate tonight. So I wanted to, let's start with Jamie. And Jamie Langowski helped create this Suffolk study or perform or this study that happened, you may have seen in the actual Globe. And she's going to be talking a little bit about that study. And I know a lot of us, if you were following it, certainly were very intrigued by the findings of this study. And this had to do with housing discrimination. But Jamie can explain it much better than I can. So I'm going to mute myself and allow her to do just that.
All right, I shared my screen, so hopefully you can see that. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present tonight. And as Crystal said, my name is Jamie Langowski. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Assistant Director of Suffolk's Housing Discrimination Testing Program. And we've been doing this work since 2012 in the greater Boston area. And just a bit of housekeeping before I launch into it. Our program is primarily funded through HUD grants, although the Boston Foundation funded the research that I'm going to discuss tonight. Any findings, recommendations, opinions are those of the HDTPs and my own, and do not necessarily reflect HUD's or the Boston Foundation's. So as Crystal said, I'm going to discuss a study that we undertook between August 2018 and July 2019 with a goal to measure the level of discrimination that is happening in the greater Boston rental market based on both race and the use of a housing voucher, meaning like Section 8 or that type of thing. We also sought to answer the question whether voucher discrimination was a proxy for race discrimination, and I'll talk more about that later on. So we worked with statisticians from an economic consulting firm called Analysis Group for the study design to figure out how many rental advertisements we'd have to test, and I'll talk about that in a second, in order to gather generalizable data with a high level of certainty. So data that was statistically significant about what is actually occurring in the rental market. And what we did was we used 200 individually trained people, 100 of whom were white and 100 of whom were Black. And the 100 white testers were divided into two groups, with 50 having profiles that they were market rate housing testers, meaning they were paying out-of-pocket rent. And then 50 had profiles that they had a housing voucher. And then the same for the 100 Black testers. 50 of that group were assigned market rate profiles, and 50 were assigned profiles that they would be using a voucher. And so for each test, 4 unique testers were assigned. 1 white market rate, 1 Black market rate, 1 white voucher, and 1 Black voucher tester. And they would individually meet with our test coordinator, get their assignment, and then they'd independently contact the advertiser. And I just want to add that we restricted our research to just Black and white individuals because we know from decades of research that discrimination levels can vary based on race and ethnicity. So we wanted to restrict the number of variables to get as accurate of a measurement as possible. So just a little bit about what testing is, or also known as matched pair testing. Each group of 4 people were similar in all ways, except for the differences in race and voucher status. So we made sure that each of the 4 had contacted the same person advertising available housing, was the same sex, similar age, same credit, same rental history. I circled this on here because all testers were searching for an apartment for just themselves to live in. Everyone's price range was the same based on the payment standards for vouchers in our area. And everyone on paper was very qualified to rent and all similarly situated. So testers are trained to simulate a real housing search. That's what we're trying to do here. And they reach out to the advertiser and they ask to set up an appointment. And the testers are trained to write down very detailed reports about what they're asked, what they said, what information they themselves offered to people, and of course, information about whether they actually got to tour an apartment, what they were told about pricing or credit requirements. And the goal is to gather information about typical business practice. You know, we're not trying to trick anyone into acting a certain way. We just have the testers present themselves as interested in setting up an appointment, and they're trained to introduce their race and or their voucher status, like whichever met their profile, and then see how they're treated. And the result is that we can compare the treatment that all 4 received, which really should have been the same because they're all similarly qualified to rent. So the way that we introduced vouchers was by having those testers with that profile state that they had a voucher just in their live interaction. And race was introduced for everyone using these names, names that are associated with race, and testers would introduce themselves both in live conversation and via voicemail. They would, every interaction, they would mention their first name. And this list was pulled from a study done by other researchers related to employment discrimination in different cities in the US, and that study did include Boston. And before I dive into what we found, I just want to acknowledge that this can be hard to hear because these numbers aren't just research. They're a measurement of what is actually happening in the rental market, and it's representative of real lived experience for many people. So we found a lot of differences in treatment related to who was able to make an appointment, how many available apartments people were told about, who got ghosted, meaning all communication was just stopped, even with the tester continuously leaving messages. The HDTP, our team, looked at the data and we found evidence of discrimination based on housing voucher usage in 86% of our tests and race-based discrimination in 71% of the tests. So it wasn't just our team that did the analyzation of this. Analysis group received all 200 tester reports and prepared the data for statistical analysis. And AG identified and defined, I'm going to get a little technical with the stats here, just to show you how intense this was. But they defined 44 outcome variables for us from the reports. And variables included things like whether the tester was invited to tour the housing site or whether an application was offered to the tester. And AG's team analyzed differences in outcomes between the 4 testing groups and by race and voucher status using what's known as t-tests. So overall, AG's analysis supported what we found, our review of the data. And we concluded that voucher discrimination was not actually a proxy for race discrimination. The data instead showed that there are just really high levels of discrimination based on both race and voucher status. And I'll highlight a few of the key findings that we found in the data that I'm going to talk about. It's statistically significant at the 90% confidence level, unless otherwise noted. And that's a standard commonly used in statistics for smaller scale studies. And confidence level demonstrates how sure we are that our data was not skewed by anything random or like by random chance. So we're very confident in our outcomes, in our findings. So tests were designed so that race and or vouchers, if that was relevant, would be revealed as early as possible in the interaction. And we found that discrimination began occurring during those initial interactions between housing providers and testers before testers even had the opportunity to see the unit. So results actually indicated that testers were significantly more likely to be ghosted. So to suddenly receive no contact from a provider without explanation. And this is after they've told them, I have a voucher. So the chart on this slide shows that the voucher testers were ghosted at a rate 4 times higher than their non-voucher counterparts, with 42% of voucher testers being ghosted compared to only 10% of non-voucher testers. We'd expect this to be much more similar if it was just everybody getting the same treatment. This finding made sense given that the testers who were using vouchers were instructed to inform the housing provider of their voucher status as soon as possible after making the first live contact. And it would only be observed after that point, after they had the opportunity to talk to the housing provider. One way in which discrimination can occur in the housing search process is simply who is able to schedule a tour. And data from our study showed that white non-voucher testers, so market rate testers, represented by the bar on the far right of the slide, were able to view apartments at a much, much higher rate than Black non-voucher testers. So 80% of our white non-voucher testers were able to view the apartment compared to only 48% of our Black market rate testers. Regardless of race, voucher testers had even less opportunity to tour apartments. Black voucher testers were able to view the apartment only 18% of the time, and white voucher testers were only able to view apartments 12% of the time. And that difference between Black and white voucher testers, it's not statistically significant. The bars at the bottom of each or at the top of each column, that shows the standard error bars. And if they overlap, the result's not statistically significant. So you can see based on the difference between the white market rate and all of the others, we have a high confidence level with this data about what is happening in the market. We also found that housing providers told Black and voucher testers about fewer available apartments than their white non-voucher counterparts. Specifically, white market rate testers on average were informed that there were over twice as many units available as Black market rate testers. And testers with a voucher were told even fewer units were available, with white non-voucher testers being informed of 5 to 6 times as many as testers of either race. I mean, it's quite a discrepancy in the numbers. The number of apartments actually shown to testers demonstrate a similar pattern. On average, white non-voucher testers were shown twice as many units as black non-voucher testers. And again, we see that testers with a voucher were shown fewer units. And this data is statistically significant at the 95% level. So this was a high level. Black and white voucher holders were at the bottom again for how many units they got to see. And it just shows that if you're seeking housing with a voucher, what we found was you're going to have to contact 10 advertisements just to be able to schedule a tour to see one. I'm not even talking about, you know, being able to rent it, just to schedule a tour, which is quite a burden. So just to kind of wrap up, I just want to say that the study was, you know, I have a lot more data, but I don't want to, you know, go overboard because we have a lot more conversation to get to. But the study was designed to mimic a real housing search that people would engage in. So testers, they were assigned and responded to rental advertisements of units that fit the parameters of our study. So it was studio or 1-bedroom apartments that ranged from $1,378 to $1,563 per month. And that was at the time, the payment standards for 1-bedroom and studios in our area. We found that the majority of the time, testers ultimately interacted with a real estate professional, meaning like someone who was working on behalf of someone else. So the numbers that I have here, 187 testers interacted with real estate professionals. Only 14 interacted with property owners and 4 interacted with property management personnel. Now, if you're doing the math, this totals more than 200 because in some instances, testers would be referred to other people by their first contact in order to continue the process. But we had analysis group doing rental scrapings for us every week of randomized apartments that fit those parameters so that our bias couldn't creep into our study. And so it was all randomized. So even with that randomization, what was available to our testers to try to set up appointments to tour, they were interacting with real estate professionals in our area. And I think that's really important, to know as we move forward in this discussion. It's also really important to remember that on paper, all testers were equally qualified to rent. But many testers were screened out and never given the opportunity to demonstrate their qualifications. They were screened out if they said they had a voucher, or they were screened out because of the name that's associated with a person being Black. So this discrimination is on top of the already financial limitations faced by people searching for housing in this price range. And last, I just want to say that a 2019 report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that, and this is a quote from their study, in no state, metropolitan area, or county in the US can a worker earning the federal or prevailing minimum wage afford a modest 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rent by working a 40-hour work week. Nowhere. So a lot of housing is already out of reach to many people based on affordability alone. But when you factor in discrimination, it becomes apparent how little choice and opportunity actually exists for many, many people. So thank you for the opportunity to present this data. The full report can be found on the Boston Foundation's website, and I'm happy to answer any questions about our design or findings at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Jamie, so much. And again, for folks who are watching, we're going to be holding questions until after everyone has presented. So, jot them down. Anything you thought was interesting, anything you need clarification for, we're gonna hold space for that. Up next is Pamela Hallett from the HCA.
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity. I have a brief presentation, which I'm going to bring up now. And so you should be able to share it. Oops, started in the middle. Well, actually, it's interesting where it did start. I'll go back in a minute, but these are our self-reported race and ethnicities from our current tenant base. So we had a total of 184 people out of our 180 2 units that actually reported on their race or their ethnicity. 24 or 13% were Black or African American. Asian was 9 or 5%. White was 100 or 54%. Other was 42 or 23%. And declined to answer at all were 34, excuse me, 18%. And 21 said that they were Hispanic, which comes to 11%. So overall, we have a pretty diverse tenant base, actually. So let me see if I can get this to go back to the beginning. Otherwise, we can just, well, I'll just keep going. So we have a long waiting list. We typically do. Right now, we have 2 portfolios. One is Capitol Square, which is composed of 32 units, 3 buildings. It's down at 252 to 260 Mass Ave, just west of the Capitol Theater by about a block and a half, 2 blocks. And so we have 79 people on our waiting list for Capitol Square. Scattered sites have 341 people for a total of 420 units. I mean, names on the wait list for 102 units, which is pretty significant. We have to do a lottery in order to gather enough people according to the Fair Housing Guidelines. And so we typically set up a separate application for each new project that we bring online. People have to fill that out. And then if they are briefly eligible, a quick eligibility, they seem to make the right income, they seem to look for the spaces that we have available, then they are put into a lottery where there literally are 1 to 200, 300, depending on how many people actually apply. Typically, we have about 200 to 250 people apply for units that might be, somewhere between 9 and 20 is what we've experienced so far. So always significantly oversubscribed. Our waitlist demographics right now are about 33% are Arlington residents. 138 of them are Section 8 holders, and there are 1,100 children, which is pretty shocking. And this is how they break down in terms of their income. 55% has income somewhere between $0 to $20,000 a year. 11% is between $40,000 and $60,000 a year, and 34% has income between $20,000 to $40,000 a year. So this basically shows you the shortfall of a typical wage for a renter in across the country for looking for a 2-bedroom home. This actually does also come from the same National Low Income Housing study that Jamie mentioned. They actually update this usually every year, although honestly, I haven't seen it in the last 2 years. But if you can see, Mass is MA, and they are short by $7.68 on an hourly basis. This is the map that Jamie was talking about. If you look, nowhere in the country can someone making minimum wage afford a 2-bedroom house, whether it's considered affordable or not. I mean, that's the horrifying part. In Massachusetts, someone would have to earn $27.39 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom typical unit. It's a shocking statistic. It's why a lot of our tenants come from units where they're paying 40, 50, sometimes 70% of their income just to remain housed. Horrifying. Most of our tenants have some kind of subsidy, not all of them. We have a number who are market rate, what you would consider market rate, in that they pay their own way. But most of our tenants come with some form of subsidy, whether it's from Somerville Homeless Coalition or Metro Housing Boston or Section 8 or MRVP vouchers from typically Arlington Housing Authority. So let me go back all the way to the beginning. Sorry, this is going to seem a little, there we go. So basically we have been, Housing Corporation of Arlington was formed in 1986. We're a 501c3 organization. We're also a membership organization. We have a membership meeting, an annual meeting every year where about 75 to 85 people show up. We used to do Tango breakfast, which they used to put on specially for us. Unfortunately, Tango closed down in the pandemic a few months ago. And so we'll have to find a new spot for us to have our annual meeting where our members are, brought up to speed on what we've done, what we plan to do, and can give us input. They vote for members of the board of directors who are running at that point for a spot on the 12-member board. So we have programs. We have the affordable housing program, which I mentioned to you, 102 units under management right now. We have 48 units that are in development. They are located at 117 Broadway and Park Ave and Lowell Street, 19R Park Ave, we call it. It's about almost 50% complete. We anticipate this spring starting our advertising for the lottery and beginning to take applications. We then anticipate the first 2 buildings being completed by the end of June or July, and starting to actually move people in with C of O's August and September. We hope to be completely rented out by the end of October. Then we also have a program called the Homelessness Prevention Program that was started in 2001. We've given out over $1 million in small grants of up to $1,500. And the goal is to keep people in safe permanent housing. So we go ahead and either pay rent, first month's rent, last month's rent. If someone's gotten into trouble and are behind in rent, they can apply for it. We also pay for moving expenses and security deposits. This year, typically in that program, we receive donations of about $36,000 and give away the vast majority of it in grants. This year, however, we've had incredibly generous donors. We've raised over $150,000 just for that program and have given the vast majority of it away already in grants. And we anticipate this coming year, we will also be inundated with more people, particularly as what does one call it? The federal program that was preventing evictions expires. We really anticipate a significant problem and anticipate being overwhelmed. We have also been participating with the town on their CARES Act funding. They also have lots of $400,000 actually, I believe, in CARES Act money to be supporting people who are in arrears on rent, as well as the Community Preservation Act gave them another $300,000. And the Department of Health and Human Services also had, I think that last count that I know of, it was about $150,000. And all of this is going to try to keep tenants who are in arrears or about to become in arrears in their permanent housing situation. All right, let's see if housing types.
I think it is, has everyone lost Pam, or is that my connection here?
No, I've lost her as well, Crystal.
Okay. So Pam, if you can hear me, I think your internet went out a little bit there, though you're still sharing your screen, so there's that. Pam, is there a way for you to switch over your internet connection? Okay. So why don't we, we'll come back to Pam because I'm seeing some questions in the chat as well for some of the data that she put together. And I want to go ahead while we work out that technical detail and move on to Connor Ring and Alex from City Life at Vita Urbana. Gentlemen, why don't you talk a little bit about your involvement in housing and also what City Life does?
Sure, I can start off for us. My name is Alex, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting us, and thanks to the other panelists that shared all the work you guys do. And I was really interested in that data that Jamie shared. You know, as a man of color who grew up in Boston, public housing, like a lot of that stuff is and like data behind it. The cold hard facts is always like really powerful and useful for the movement as an organizer. So thank you so much for doing that work. It's incredible. So I wanted to quickly talk about our work at City Life and also the guiding principles behind our work. And we mentioned it earlier, we believe that housing is a human right. And me personally, I kind of feel like anything essential to human life should be a human right, where, you know, not treated as a privilege, but a given. And for that to happen, I feel like we really need to stop treating things like commodities. And that really puts us at odds with the market ideology, where one has to buy at the highest, buy at the lowest possible and then sell or rent at the highest possible. And by operating in such a way, you know, that's how we see things like racism come into play. Because how do you get something at the lowest amount possible? You know, that's, you know, by operating that way, that's how we have things like foreclosure, and we have racist policies like redlining. And that's how we have like landlords right now trying to evict folks during a pandemic. That's how our system is operating in a way that the more exploitative that you can be, the more profit you'll make. And that is just completely at odds with how we think things should be. We don't think that housing should be a commodity. We think it's a human right. So those are the principles that guide our work. And I know I said it puts us at odds with the market, but there is middle ground. And that's how our work is focused, is trying to find that middle ground with landlords and developers so that we can create stability for residents and homeowners. So what does that look like? It can look like, a good example is one of our cases at Morton Village, which was over 200 apartments that we were able to negotiate a 5-year contract that would cap rent increases for 3%, and it would stabilize those households for 5 years. And we also work with our nonprofit developers so that they can put in an offer on a building, and we can rally behind that offer so that property can be taken off the market and stabilized, but with nonprofit developers. And, you know, we're also advocating for housing policy, both local and national, and we're also helping folks with their individual cases. We find out about a unit, or in some cases an entire building, where folks are being kicked out or getting huge rent increases. And one of our biggest strengths we have is the people themselves, you know, getting together and talking to your neighbors, and really using that people power and sharing your voice, sharing your testimony to empower everyone around you so that folks can fight for what they need to survive. And, you know, we have Connor here on the line, who is actually one of our community leaders that really has developed through this type of struggle in Arlington. And, you know, this type of work would not be possible without people like Connor, who, are in the problem themselves, but they work for everybody in their community and really become leaders that we really absolutely need, because our crew is a slim crew, but with volunteers like Connor, we're able to get a lot of work done. So maybe Connor, if you wanted to share a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for that really nice introduction. So I'll just say my name is Connor Ring. I'm a graduate student in urban planning at Tufts. I've lived in Arlington for the past 6 years. As Alex said, I got involved with city life when a developer investor bought our apartment building in Arlington on Mass Ave, right across the street from the high school. There are actually two buildings, part of the same parcel, valued at something like $4 million each, and the developer paid about $16 million for them, which essentially sort of bakes in gentrification, right? Because all of a sudden they have a larger mortgage to pay, they have higher taxes to pay to the city. And so really it puts the renters in a squeeze, because we were market rate renters over 100 families. So I got involved. I went to City Life. I started going to meetings. I found out a little bit more about the organization. They connected me not only to legal help that was able to advise us on strategy, but also organizers like Alex and other people in City Life who sort of helped us become organized and figure out what we could do to negotiate with the developer. And they also put us in contact with other tenants of the same landlord in Jamaica Plain, and we were able to work collectively to collectively negotiate rents and stabilize families in 4 buildings, so 2 buildings in Jamaica Plain and these 2 buildings in Arlington. And I think, it was a great experience, not only because of what we were able to accomplish, which was to negotiate with our collective power. We were able to negotiate below market rents for a lot of elderly families and immigrant families here in Arlington who would have otherwise been displaced had we not organized. But also we were able to connect as neighbors and kind of support each other in that process. And I think, that was really just as important. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions or about that experience. And yeah, Krista, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Alex and Connor. Pam has come back to us. I wanted to know, Pam, did you have anything else you wanted to add, or do you want to go right to the questions that folks have?
I think we should go right to the questions.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. So I want to go, we're getting a number of questions about Jamie's work right now. Jamie, one of the first questions was about the cities and communities that the study was conducted in. And I understand that Arlington was one of those communities. My question is was there a difference in the type or level of discrimination, say an area that was more urban, like Boston or downtown Boston, versus Arlington, which is a more suburban community, more of a bedroom community, as they say?
That would be an interesting thing to look at, but that's not actually what we were gathering data on. So we didn't design it in that way. The sites were all chosen so that our testers could take public transportation from Boston Center to them. And that's how we ended up. And I posted in the chat the towns that we did. And then in the report, you can see also all the different neighborhoods of Boston. But what was really interesting is that we gave analysis group our parameters. So studio or 1 bedroom, because we had everybody saying they were just looking for themselves, because we didn't want to bring in, families with kids, because that would have increased the number of testers we would have needed. The rental amount, we provided all this data to analysis group, and then they did a scraping every week of the listings, and then they'd send it to us, and we'd just go down the list for what was available and send our testers. So when you're doing it that way, which is similar to maybe what someone who is, wanting a place within public transportation reach of Boston within that price range, it's already very limited with what you're getting for the scraping. But, we did test Arlington a few times out of those 50 tests. And the goal was just to get generalizable data so that we can say with certainty, with high confidence, this is what's happening in the market. And so I can't really say that we found a difference between those communities, but we definitely found a lot of discrimination happening, which I think a lot of people know, is occurring. Although the interesting thing, and I didn't really dive into it, I'll just add, is this concept of discrimination with a smile. A lot of people don't realize that they're experiencing discrimination or receiving negative differential treatment, because what'll happen is someone will ghost them. They just won't call back. And so someone doesn't necessarily know why they didn't get called back. Or to the discrimination with a smile phrase, they're being treated very politely, but they're told something just went off the market. But then we know from having our other testers contacting for the same thing that it's still available. But one person doesn't have that point of contact to know that it's a lie.
Right.
I would just add to that, Crystal, if I could, as somebody who's just gone through the process recently of acquiring housing in Arlington, even as a white male who I'm not a voucher holder, I don't have children or other things that people could discriminate. I was just amazed at the amount of gatekeeping that's involved in that whole process, right? Where you text somebody and they say, tell me a little about yourself. And just, from that immediate sort of introduction, everything is geared towards, let me suss out exactly what kind of person this is. And there's so much space there for the kind of things that Jamie is talking about. There's so much space for discrimination that it's really, I don't even know where to begin.
Guillermo has asked, is an 100% affordable housing overlay an effective way to reduce development costs and allow for more affordable units? Cambridge and Somerville have passed theirs. Oh, sorry. Do any of you all have any expertise in that? Did you hear the question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the overlay is a brand new vehicle to try to do affordable housing. I have no idea whether it's going to work or not. My concern with an overlay is that from what I've heard, I haven't read it myself, but from what I've heard is there are certain stipulations anyway. For instance, I heard that in Cambridge, you cannot develop more than 50% of the lot. That's pretty significant. When our buildings that we're building, we take up far more than 50% of every lot that we're building. We don't do very much parking because our tenants don't have cars. They don't need it. And so we don't want to waste the space. So if an overlay has that requirement, it really doesn't do us very much good. I also would be afraid that an overlay district would tend to ghettoize affordable housing. They could only happen in certain sections of the town or municipality, and that would concern me. We like to have people spread out through all neighborhoods, just as a better way to truly have a diverse and integrated community. So those would be my concerns with an overlay district.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add also just what we are considering to be affordable. I know in Boston that most affordable housing is at 70% of the area median income. And for one person, that's about $68,000. That is not affordable for a good chunk of Boston. So if we're calling that affordable, then it's really going to leave out a large number of folks. And we know that means Black and brown folks. So we need to really look at a different solution. And I think that is controlling the market. We need rent control and things like that to be able to really keep folks in their homes.
Alex, that's a great point in terms of the definitions of affordability. Just a quick kind of tidbit. When I was going through my housing search recently, one of the sites that came up was an inclusionary zoning unit up at the old Sims Hospital that I think is up to 120% of the area median income. So it was renting for something like $2,400, which was already out of our price zone. So the fact that that is included in Arlington's affordable housing is, to me, doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Especially when you have to pay for your own utilities there. You pay for heat, electric, everything. So you add that on top of the rent, it's pretty expensive.
Linda asked, what is the law regarding Section 8 vouchers and the right to rent?
I can speak to the law related to housing vouchers under Massachusetts 151B. A right to rent is a little bit different, which we don't have. But what we do have is an anti-discrimination law that makes it illegal to not rent to someone because they have a housing voucher. There are a lot of places in the country that people can legally exclude voucher holders, but not Massachusetts. So that made our study particularly troubling that we have these laws. I mean, it's been illegal to discriminate based on race since 1866. But housing voucher, it's a much more recent law. So both of the classes that we studied, you're not supposed to do that in Massachusetts. So what 151B Chapter 4 says is that you can't discriminate against a person because they have a voucher. So they can't be treated differently, given different terms and conditions, refuse to rent, that sort of thing. People can, part of a problem is that people can be legally priced out. Someone isn't allowed to apply a voucher to a, $4,000 a month apartment or anything that's outside of the payment standards. And the payment standards, as Pamela showed it, with what things cost across the nation, and as we know in our area, I mean, it costs a lot to rent and they just don't cover it. And so what happens is people with vouchers end up in very specific areas and neighborhoods because that's where they can afford to rent and use the voucher. But basically the law is pretty straightforward. You can't not rent to someone because they have a voucher if your apartment is available and it's within that payment standard.
Well, and part of what happens is, particularly in an area like Arlington that is very competitive, lots of demand and not enough housing, landlord or whoever's showing the apartment can screen people out just because there are other people that are willing to pay and they don't have a Section 8 certificate. So they don't want to wait for the Section 8 inspections. They don't want to run the risk of having to do more repairs to the unit that the inspector would find. And so it's much easier to effectively discriminate because they're just choosing people that don't have vouchers.
Yeah, and I would like to add with respect to the inspections, yes, they do have to occur for voucher holders, but they're making sure the apartment's up to code. I mean, it's not like they're asking them to do vanity things to the apartment or anything like that. These changes are necessary under the law, and market rate tenants should be demanding them as well. I mean, there's supposed to be proper locks on the doors and windows and heat and things like that. That's what they're inspecting for.
Yeah, good electric, good heat, good plumbing.
I believe this question is for you, Pam. Jennifer was curious about the number of children mentioned. I think in one of your slides, it seemed high to her. Is the number of kids correct? And I don't know.
That was based on who was on our waiting list when we did that analysis. We don't have nearly that many children in our units. I think total, we have less than 30 children in our units, in our 102 units. The biggest demand we find for our units is between 1 and 2 bedrooms. And so you really can't fit very many children in the buildings. Our children go into our larger units, which are the 3 and 4 bedrooms, which we really don't have that much demand for. I think it's that children are expensive.
In the lottery you mentioned, do you have to live in Arlington or can you live anywhere?
No, you do not have to live in Arlington. We have the right to not choose someone if they're not an Arlington resident. But if you saw, we have 33% of the people on our waiting list are from Arlington. So we would typically go ahead and fill up the buildings with people from outside of Arlington as well.
And Connor, this question is for you. I'm not sure if you would know this, but what was the breakdown of the households in the building, which was purchased by the developer you mentioned? Single, couple, families with children, elderly, race, ethnicity, if you know that information.
Yeah, sure. I answered it in the chat, but I can answer it here as well. It was a pretty interesting mix of everything. There were a lot of elderly singles, elderly couples, people on fixed income, immigrant families, younger families, younger couples like myself and my wife. Yeah, a good mix of all sort of age ranges and ethnicities. There were immigrant families from Central and South America. There was a strangely large Nepalese community in the buildings.
And this question is, I'm not sure for any of you all who may have some knowledge base in this. How is it decided, or who decides whether to use nonprofit developers? What are the benefits or drawbacks?
So it's really up to who's selling, who they want to sell to. So I'll give you guys an example. In Jamaica Plain, there was this building on Washington Street owned by a developer named City Realty. And they posted it on the market for a huge asking price. And usually the only folks that can afford such a huge asking price are for-profit developers. So, and actually part of that building they were trying to sell had a restaurant there that was in the neighborhood for 30 years. So in their ad, they essentially said that, oh, you can evict the restaurant if you want. So the ad had built-in like displacement into it. But what the community did was protest every single time that City Realty came to a neighborhood council to try to get approvals regarding any of their developments. Folks showed up and talked about their displacement practices. When they went down to the BPDA, the agency that gives approvals for variances in Boston, folks went down to those meetings too and talked about all their displacement practices. And there was so much community pressure that when we talked to Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation and asked them to put in an offer, they put in the offer, and there was so much pressure from the community to do the right thing here, City Realty, do the right thing, that they eventually sold to a nonprofit developer. The city helped out with making that happen. And it was just a really great example of how like community can influence what is being developed in their neighborhood. And you know, I do want to give a little credit to City Realty because they didn't have to sell it to the nonprofit developer, but there were so many eyes on them and so much community support that, you know, it really encouraged that kind of sale. So I don't know if that answered the question completely, but maybe others want to add a bit more to that.
I would just say, you know, I respect so much the work of City Life and Alex. And I don't think that what Alex is saying is that, you know, the long-term answer to affordable housing in Arlington or in other places is to protest and hope that, you know, the owner sells to a nonprofit developer. But I think and Alex, you can correct me if I'm wrong. What I think City Life is trying to do is pointing towards a different future whereby real estate and land is not just seen as a commodity that's sold, that's always sold to the higher bidder. That, places like the building that I lived on Mass Ave, they're filled with families. They're filled with people who have long roots in the community. People in my building have lived there for 25 years. And those people matter to a community. And when we as a community don't value that at all, when we just say, well, if the building got sold, nothing we can do, now it's going to be remodeled and new tenants are going to go in and now they're paying $2,800 instead of $1,600. That's not okay. And we need to do something about it. And we might not necessarily have the answers right now, but we can work together and figure out, what the tools are in our toolbox that we need to do to stabilize the existing base of renters, and also work with organizations like PAM's to create new opportunities for housing to help Arlington grow.
We would love that. We would love to see some agitation here for, yes, we compete on the open market for properties, and property prices in Arlington are really quite high. And so, yeah, a little agitation wouldn't hurt us at all.
One question from Karen is, if we only have very low income housing and market housing, which requires the most subsidy, capital, and operating, where do very low income people go when their income increases? What about current moderate income residents who are at risk of displacement by the market? Do we really need to make an either or choice between very low income, or moderate income? Sounds like, Connor, you were in this kind of situation. Like, you weren't in the very low income bracket, but you were still being priced out for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, that's pretty much true. And I don't really want to completely center my experience in the discussion. My wife and I, she's a teacher at the high school, so we're sort of middle income folks. We probably would have been fine. We're not going to be able to buy a house in Arlington, but we, in the end, we were going to be fine. But I think there were a lot of folks who still live in that building where that wasn't the case. And I'm not sure where they go. I don't know that we have an answer to that. Maybe they are, there were people who, when I left, they were talking about looking for a house out in Western Massachusetts, or, the drive to you qualify kind of situation, or, moving in with family, someplace in Chelsea or Everett or someplace cheaper. So I don't think there's a simple answer there. I don't know what happens to those people. They kind of fall through the cracks and we don't think about them because they're not on any wait lists. They're not on, they're not in public housing or whatever. They just have to move. And it's sort of like a migration. People who have lived in Boston, low income, moderate income people who have lived in Boston for a while know about the gentrification migration. First you live in Somerville, then you go to Medford, and then Medford gets too expensive, and then you go to Everett. And I don't think that's okay. I don't think that's a good way to have a city, to have a culture that just becomes eroded when a place becomes too expensive. So.
Yeah, a lot of the subsidized loans and things that we use really judge you on what income levels you're going to be renting to. However, there is workforce housing, which has not really taken off very well across the country. There are specific programs for that, which I would call someone in a moderate income level would qualify as workforce housing, but so far there isn't a whole lot of subsidy for that type of development. Developments are very expensive in this part of the country. So probably almost as expensive as New York's now. And California's is, I think we're even with development costs in California. So it just makes it very difficult.
I think this is a great, oh,
Sorry,
yeah.
go ahead. I was just going to say, just to give you a sense on the pricing, I'm working now on a project with the redevelopment of the Charlestown housing project. It's the largest public housing complex in New England. The developers are building about 1,500 units of market rate housing and replacing the 1,100 units of public housing. And their pro forma analysis shows per unit costs of about $645,000, which they're trying to decrease, but that just gives you a sense of how expensive it is to build a unit of housing in Boston.
I think this is a great question for all of you. Lynette asks, if Arlington is committed to reaching its 10% affordable housing goal, why would it allow for-profit developers to build in town? I guess what's the risk reward in that if the goal is to get to 10% affordable housing?
Well, I don't know that you can prevent people from developing. If they purchase a property and they can do it by right, there isn't a whole lot you can do. What you can do is change the zoning to allow it more likely to be developed as affordable housing as opposed to market rate. Right now, many of the parcels in town take a lot of work through the Arlington Redevelopment Board or the Zoning Board of Appeals to even allow us to build affordable housing that is higher than 2 or 3 stories. So that's a significant impediment to getting affordable housing built. So a developer who comes in with a lot of cash can pick up the property and do what he wants to do and turn it around and sell it for the kind of pricing that is happening across the board in the market in Arlington. You have many people coming in with lots of money. They've left New York or they've left California or somewhere else, sold houses, and they have cash burning their pockets. And it makes it easier for them to purchase something here than anyone that's more in the affordable housing range.
Is 10% enough? I'm curious, especially, Jamie, who studied this, and Pamela, is 10% enough of a high enough goal for affordable housing in Arlington?
It's a state mandated.
No.
It's not, but it's state mandated. That's all. That's where the 10% comes from.
That's the 40B provision. Is that correct?
No, it can tie into the 40B provision. You can say it that way.
So what are, given all of your different perspectives, what should be Arlington's best practices moving forward to have a town where folks can live and work and stay in this community? I'm part of a family who's a 4th generation Arlington residents. And I tell you, we had to do some creative math to stay in the community that, my husband's grandparents and great-grandparents settled here for. So I think that that's a relatable experience for lots of folks, or folks who just like our community because it's super great, obviously. So what is the best practice to balance creation of affordable housing, to understand that there are going to be market forces in that? And what's the best practice in making sure our community also remains a diverse place?
Well, from my perspective as an affordable housing developer, we really need to address the zoning issues. Zoning was put in place based on a lot of discrimination. It was against African Americans, against Jews, against Irish, against a wide variety of cultural groups. And if you go and look at where each of those zoning pieces came from, it really was based on discrimination. So I think we need to go back through tear that apart and open up the zoning to allow a lot more development by right. If that happens, things will happen more quickly because you won't have to go through the special permit process or the zoning change process. And it will allow a lot more people to, it'll be more dense, which will allow a lot more people to have housing at various income levels.
And Pam's point is a really good one. We can't lose sight of the fact that our laws and our city ordinances, they were made with racist intention. Many of them were. And so what we're operating under are these same laws and zoning ordinances, rules, things that were there put in place in order to segregate people. I mean, we didn't get the high level of segregation that we have in our communities and throughout the nation, actually, just organically based on choice. It was definitely encouraged and structured by the government at the federal level, the state level, city levels. Ibram Kendi has a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of my favorite lines in that book that he writes is, there's no such thing as a race neutral policy or law. It's either encouraging, it's either racist or it's anti-racist. And so we need to evaluate our zoning ordinances for that, with an eye toward that, to see, what was this put in place for and what's the effect that it's having and had.
Word. Yes, I agree. I agree, but I also think that, we can't just build our way out of this problem. We also need to protect the folks that are here right now. And that means we need tenant protections, like rent control and tenant right of first refusal. And we need to make sure that tenants that are in the housing court have lawyers. And we need to make sure that folks have resources. So along with those zoning suggestions, we also need protections for folks to keep folks in their homes.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of Alex's point, I think zoning is really, really important, but I also think that zoning tends to suck so much of the oxygen out of the housing debate. And when we talk about zoning, we really fail to talk about so many other things. We live in an immensely unequal society. I think, Pam and Jamie both talked about the pay gap in terms of what a low-income person can afford. That is not something we're going to be able to address as a town. That's something we have to address as a society. If we want to talk about stuff that we can address as a town, yes, we can amend zoning. We can make it slightly easier to build multifamily housing along Mass Ave and along Broadway, where most of the renters already live, right? Because the reason we'd be doing that is because, let's be honest, it's socially acceptable, right? It's not socially acceptable right now to propose multifamily housing in Arlington Heights or in Morningside or in other neighborhoods that could probably fit a lot more housing. Has anybody asked the renters that live along Mass Ave right now if they want more, 6-story buildings crammed alongside where they're already living? I don't think so. So I think zoning is very important, but I think there's also a lot of other aspects to the housing issue. And I think Jamie's research really talks about that as well and speaks to that. The fact that there's discrimination in the housing market right now. There will be discrimination in the housing market if Arlington amends its zoning. So I think, there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. Zoning could really help us move forward a little bit. It could maybe help Pam and the HCA build some more affordable housing, make it easier for her to build some affordable housing so that new renters could move into Arlington, or that people who are at risk of being displaced right now could maybe stay. And I think that's a really important point, but it's not everything. There's a lot of discussion to be had, and I'm just really glad that we're here, and to see the way that this discussion has evolved over time in Arlington is really, it's really great to see.
Yeah, I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. We have to get the ADU approved. We have to make it easy for people to create smaller or additional units within their own either buildings or outbuildings or larger spaces. You know, we need to allow different types of housing. There's so many elderly single people sometimes, or couples living in these massive houses. They don't want to necessarily move, but they also can't really afford to keep them. I mean, you know, we need to bring back the concept of sharing space, you know, renting out rooms, all of that sort of thing would make a significant difference and could probably easily bring on hundreds of units of affordable housing in Arlington. The tiny homes, you know, right now they are not allowed, period, unless you have a space that is a lot that is set up for trailers. You know, we don't have that in Arlington. We don't have that probably in most of Massachusetts. So, you know, all of this there are just so many impediments to getting a variety of housing types. And it's a problem, but you can only attack so many pieces at once, right? You need you need many more warriors who are out there coming from different aspects.
And what do you think about a real estate transfer fee?
I love it. I've been working with the coalition to implement it, and we now have one of our selectmen, Len Diggins, who is joining the coalition and participating. So yes, we're definitely in favor of it. We'll be bringing a warrant to the next town meeting to support it.
What do you all suggest as a solution to the discrimination that Jamie found, and of course folks experience by realtors and owners? How do you regulate that?
You know, it's against the law. And all the realtors have real estate licenses. I think one way you attack it is go back to the real estate board and say, hey, here is the study that was done. And the majority of the units were shown by realtors. What does that say?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you take a look at the study, and I posted the link to it in there, we do talk about that is in place, and there is a licensing board. We tried to get data on how many people had been reprimanded or had license suspended for discrimination, and we couldn't find any data on a single agent or licensed real estate agent. I think that we do have these laws in place. There's a problem with enforcement, and one of the major problems is that we rely on the victims to, you know, bring the enforcement actions. And when someone is looking for housing, that's their priority, not to engage in litigation, you know. And so, and there's that discrimination with a smile element that some people don't even know what they're experiencing. And so in answer to that question about what can happen, you know, we have a whole recommendation section, but fair housing organizations are critical in this fight, because fair, like ours, the HDTP, we also represent individuals who suspect that they've been discriminated against. You know, we sometimes can do testing to support their claim. You know, we help them file at HUD or the MCAD, or, you know, it can be in court. You know, we make sure we do a lot of education and outreach so that people understand their rights and their responsibilities. But because we rely so much on victims to come forward with what's happening, it's too rampant. You know, it's too big of a problem for that. So we need testing organizations to be funded at such a high level that so much testing can happen. And then offices like the Attorney General's office or the MCAD or, you know, some human rights commissions have the capability to bring their own complaints based on testing. And so we're not waiting for a victim to figure out or have time or the, you know, make that a priority in their life to come forward. So that is one thing that really is a major thing. We're also working on a few items of legislation that we think would be helpful. We have a number of recommendations in our report, and I'm hoping that next year we'll have some movement on some of those.
One of the questions that we got from Joanne Preston is, why would changing zoning actually lead to affordable housing? Would more units not just increase the number of luxury apartments? Most renters along Mass Ave live in modest apartments with basic kitchens. they would face displacement. ADU could require affordable rents, not the current proposal. So that's Joanne's question.
Well, I guess I'm not sure where a lot of that is coming from. If you don't drive down Mass Ave, there are tons of buildings that are 1 and 2 stories that could easily be built around and above to create a more dense environment. There are a lot of spaces around Arlington that, if they were not single family zoned, but allowed larger buildings, it would spread out a lot of that, what people are concerned about, density. There's, there are lots of opportunities. People always tell me, well, you'll never find any place to build in Arlington, but honestly, we've created now in 2012, we had 58 units. We have now 102, and with another 48 that are being built. You just have to see the opportunity that's there. You have to be willing to go through all the hoops. And so if you change zoning, the hoops become fewer, become less time restrictive, and allow properties to transfer ownership. So I
would just add to that as well. I think that's a really fair question from Joanne, because you see a lot of the new developments that are popping up, and the rents are unattainable. You can call them luxury, or basically anything that's new multifamily housing is luxury, right? But what I would say is that if you are going to increase the density, if you are going to say, okay, you have a lot, you can only build 1 story, but now you can build 3 stories. If you just make that change without adding any provisions for affordable housing, you're really just giving away the farm to the owner, because the owner really just accrues all of that added value of now being able to build higher on his property. Pam, correct me if I'm wrong here. But so what I would suggest is that if you're going to increase the density along Mass Ave or along Broadway, you have to bake in provisions that say, yes, you can build, but you have to build X number of units affordable, and that, that's, you can work
Absolutely.
out the details for inclusionary zoning or whatever. But
I would agree. Inclusionary zoning, and it's one of the things that people are very afraid of, 40Bs, and yet 40Bs, 25% of the units would have to be affordable. And if the town wanted to, they could really insist that the affordability be at 60% instead of 80% or 100% of median income, or even lower. That's something that the town could actually take on.
And we only have just about 5 minutes left, so I want to ask the last question in the chat here. What happens to, Elizabeth has this question, what happens to all the tenants while you build around and above to prevent their displacement and having to leave Arlington?
You require relocation.
What does that mean, require relocation?
Relocation is, for instance, if we purchased a building that had tenants in it, not only would we do it because it's our philosophy, but our funding sources would require that we have to pay and help people find places to live. That's relocation. And so that would be something that the town could take on as a philosophy, as a policy, that if someone is going to be taking a building and emptying it out in order to develop it or redevelop it, then they'd be required to pay relocation and help people find a place to live.
Interesting. So just as we wrap up, I want to give you all each an opportunity to, to make any closing remarks. Again, this is just the first of a series. of panels that we will be having on Arlington. I posted in the chat the email. If there are other issues in housing that you would like us to discuss, you can email the Human Rights Commission at ahrcevents@gmail.com. And a recording of this discussion will be on our YouTube page, Arlington Human Rights. But before we go, I do want to give you all an opportunity for closing remarks here. And I guess since Pam, you're the first one unmuted, I'm going to have you start.
Well, thank you. This has been a great opportunity. We should have many more of these conversations, get more into depth on each of these pieces that we brought up: zoning, racism, discrimination, all of the pieces that work, and all of those other parts of this multi-pronged effort that we are all willing to sort of embrace and work towards. So I'd love to see that happen. Thank you.
Jamie, why don't you jump in there?
Oh, sure. I'll just say that thank you for this opportunity. And conversations like this are so important. I mean, obviously my work revolves around housing, as many of you. And so I see this as one of the most important things, you know, in a person's life, and it impacts every measurable outcome, from health to education to, you know, over time, wealth, you know, generation. I mean, it's so important, and it's too important to leave to the private market to not have the government work to correct a lot of what it has done. And you know, to Alex's point, I mean, it is a human right, and it's so important that we address the needs of all. And I mean, it's going to be a very challenging year next year when the eviction moratorium ends, and many people who are living paycheck to paycheck are displaced and, you know, are being evicted, and they're going to have an even harder time to find places with that record and with that debt. So I think that we're going to have to take a very hard look at how we work to help people with their housing situations.
Alex O'Connor, there you go.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all for sharing so much. It was amazing. And we need to keep the conversation going. But to Jamie's point, I wanted to plug some homework for you guys. And I'm going to drop it in the chat. But if everyone listening can actually go to housingguarantee.org, you guys can help us fight for a stronger eviction moratorium, because we just found out that the CDC eviction moratorium was extended for 30 days, but that's just really the bare minimum that we can do. But it gives the Biden administration enough time to get into office, and then once they're in office, they can propose something much stronger, maybe something that looked like our statewide eviction moratorium, which was the strongest in the country. You know, it's something that stopped the entire eviction process. You couldn't even send out notices to quit, which, you know, that's the beginning process of an eviction. And, you know, it allowed folks to be protected without applying for it. You know, the CDC moratorium as it is now, folks have to send a declaration. So we really need something a lot stronger. And by going to housingguarantee.org, you guys can plug in and fight for something stronger. And just wanted to thank everyone again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for your amazing research, and Pam for the work that you do every day. People might not know this, but when I guess this was a year ago in August, when I was scrambling to figure out what we were going to do about when our building was sold, Pam was one of the first people I called, and she showed up at our first meeting and, you know, offered her help to anybody who needed it. So that was really helpful. And I would just say that, yeah, it's great to see how this discussion has evolved over time. I remember standing out on Mass Ave back in May and June with other people at the protests after the murder of George Floyd, and just sort of thinking, like, we need to be doing something else. We need to be organizing. We need to be talking about housing in town. And so to see how those protests have evolved locally into discussions like this, and people doing sort of the hard background work where nobody waves and nobody honks, You have to have hard discussions. It's just really great to see. So thank you, Crystal and Christina, for organizing this. And I really look forward to future discussions.
Well, I want to thank you all, and I'm really excited to continue this conversation in our community and invite you all back. I think some folks have already requested it, so you might be getting an email from me. But again, just if you'd like to see this recording on our YouTube page, Arlington Human Rights, double check in the chat. There's a bunch of great links to content there. I'm gonna give you guys a few more seconds to go back in there and make sure you copy some of those links there, because great resources, and we're going to have those resources available on our website as well, arlingtonhumanrights.org. So for all of us on the Human Rights Commission and of course in the DEI office with Christina Coleman and Jillian Harvey, thank you so much for your time. And you guys have a great night and amazing holiday season. Thank you.